A nyní poprosím paní Márii Schmidt o její laureátskou řeč.
Thank you. True. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to get such a big and important award. Thank you so much. Saint Adalbert of Prague was born around 955 in Pomerania and was martyred on the 23rd of April 997 in what is now northern Poland, where he was killed on his missionary journey. Saint Adalbert served as a bishop of Prague, a missionary in Hungary and Prussia, where he is revered as both countries' Christian martyr. He spread the Christian faith in Poland and in the Czech lands. He came to Hungary at the invitation of great Grand Chief Géza. Legend holds that our first king, Saint Stephen, was baptized by him. We don't know if that was true or not, but the mere fact that tradition attributes to him this act, which was so important for the course of Hungarian history, confirms his historical significance and Saint Adalbert missionary activity in Hungary. This is why Esztergom Cathedral, the seat of Hungary's Catholic Church, bears the name of Virgin Mary and Saint Adalbert, and why the building of the seminary at the foot of the cathedral is called Saint Adalbert Center. Since 2001, in Saint Adalbert's remembrance, the Hungarian Catholic Church has annually awarded the Saint Adalbert Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, 1,000 years ago, our region was converted through Christianity and thereby became part of the Western cultural world. Since then, our destinies have been intertwined by 1,000 threads, despite occasional diverging directions. But our shared Christian culture, our shared destiny, and common interests inspire us again and again to seek a common path. We have had common rulers, we have fought against threats of Turkish, Germanic, and Russian origin, and if we look back to the recent past, apart from the interwar period of the 20th century, we have followed the same path for centuries. First within the Habsburg and then within the Soviet empires. The Habsburg ruled in Europe for 16 generations, over 20 countries, including our region. A prominent figure in our shared past was Emperor and King Francis Joseph from 1848 to 1916. He reigned for nearly 67 years, almost 7 decades. During his long reign, he made a real institution of himself. In an age drunken with optimistic faith in progress and development, while industrializing and modernizing at a frenetic pace, he represented stillness, permanency, and continuity. He was the last ruler of old Europe, representative and defender of traditional beliefs and values. He combined the role of the mythical king with that of a tireless servant of his empire, There was pomp and grandeur, there were balls, receptions, but there was also duty from dawn till dusk. He successfully moderated the various national and political antagonism into peaceful coexistence, softening the most ardent radicalism into balanced diversity. Over time, he became like a fossilized archaeological find. He became everyone's father, grandfather, even great-grandfather. There was no citizens of this dual monarchy of 51 million inhabitants covering 621,038 square kilometers from the Carpathians to the Adriatic who had lived to see another monarch than Franz Joseph. At his death, his empire was left behind in the midst of a deadly and bloody European civil war, First World War. The Habsburg monarchy was certainly the most enduring, most resistant empire in the history of modern Europe. It fulfilled its vocation until the rest of the world's great powers decided otherwise. The vocation was to ensure that neither Germans, nor Russians, nor Turks, nor anyone else had a free passage into the heart of Europe. The supranational, multi-ethnic Habsburg monarchy was a breakwater in the ambitions of the pan-Germanic, pan-Slavic, and anti-Western Ottoman empires. Conversely, its removal opened a window of opportunity for all three. The dismembered Austro-Hungarian Empire had been only second in Europe to Russia and the third most populous state in Europe, after the Russian and the German empires. The destruction of the Habsburg monarchy was also fueled by hatred against Catholics, an inclination so characteristic of France's atheist Clemenceau, Britain's Protestant Lloyd George, and Protestant Wilson of the United States. It is no coincidence that Geneva, the city of Calvin and Rousseau, was chosen as the headquarters of the League of Nations, the first collective security organization seen as a first step towards a new utopian universalist world government. The victorious powers of World War I decided to dismember the Habsburg monarchy because they were confident that they would no longer need its balancing and countervailing role. But it soon became clear that without a Central European empire, there remained nothing to contain the expansionist forces threatening the peace of the continent. The vacuum created by his absence encouraged the German side at first. With their Third Reich, they brought our continent and, of course, themselves to the brink of destruction. Then came the Soviets, who made our region part of their empire. However, they overcommitted themselves, and by 1990, their empire collapsed as well. In recent years, our continent has once again come under migratory pressure from the south. 100 years on, it is clear how indispensable the Habsburg monarchy was to the security and the balance of power of Europe. It is becoming increasingly clear that those who decided to abolish it after the First World War were not only clumsy, short-sighted, and ignorant, but above all, fatally irresponsible. The dissolution of the Habsburg Empire took place before the eyes of the post-war generation. In its wake, the way of life of the peoples of Europe changed and began to be Americanized. US President Wilson Exhilarated by his victory, saw the abolition of monarchies and their conversion to a republican form of government as the first stepping stone towards Americanization. The US started exporting democracy with the resulting chaos, which has been a constant feature of American politics ever since. Thus, the emperors of Germany and Austria has to go. British and other Western monarchs could say, obviously, those people could not be subjected to experiments as freely as East European and other barbarians. This plunged the region into a crisis of legitimacy that set back its development for decades. The world of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was multifaceted, diverse, and easygoing, or as it was then called, clumsy, which made life exciting and bearable. What survived the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Habsburg Empire is looked upon with nostalgia and appreciation. We are at home in Trieste, Krakow, Prague, Budapest, and Vienna because their cultural traditions are part of our shared, cherished heritage. The European order, created in 1920, it's a clumsy and superficial manner, has hardly been adjusted to this day. The new booty-seeking peace treaties of 1944-47 produced the novelty that while the borders drawn in 1920 were left almost untouched, the minorities forced behind them, more than 12 million people, including Hungarians, Slovaks, Swaps, and other Germans, were deported from one country to another. The criminal and harmful peace agreements that were imposed on the world in 1920 and then ratified in 1945, partly because the decisions maker had no better idea, and partly because they had neither the wisdom nor the talent to create a new one, still define the world today. The global clash of World War I set the whole of the 20th century on a rigid trajectory, thus becoming a seminal catastrophe. And as we have seen, its impact is still felt today. The two parts of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire have now become two separate worlds. Austria has shed its Catholicism, its bourgeois ethos, and above all, its Central Europeanism. The Austrians seem unable to come to terms with their Habsburg heritage. Without it, who and what are they? We, by contrast, have not denied the more than 400 years of our history as part of the empire, acknowledging its achievements and being critical of its mistakes. Ladies and gentlemen, the advanced West still sees its 20th century victories in two world wars as its basis for legitimacy. In Western political thinking and public discourse, the division between winners and losers is still unchanged after 100 years what have passed. That's why the foreign minister of Turkey recently said that World War I was not over because the Paris peace treaties are still in force. 100 years ago, the victorious Westerners squeezed multi-ethnic Hungary into a homogeneous nation-state. Although the Carpathian Basin had been for thousands of years one of the most ethnically diverse regions of Europe, by that time, the western half of Europe was already made up of homogeneous nation-states, while we had various national communities and peoples living together. By now, however, the tables have turned. Now they have become multi-ethnic as a backlash of colonialism, and thus, in 2015, they came up with the idea that we should allow Muslim immigration so that we too became multi-ethnic again. Yes, they still believe that they can tell us again and again whom we can and cannot live with. Today, we live in a geostrategically weakened Europe created by the Entente powers 100 years ago. The center of Europe was empty, the victorious powers being unable or unwilling to fill the void left by the Habsburg Empire. The Germans and the Russians now had a clear path to the east, west, and south. From 1945 to 1990, the West created a bipolar world and subordinated the center of Europe, including our region, to the Soviets. Nearly half a century of Soviet occupation became our shared historical experience and brought our region closer together again. Just like our shared experience of the collapse of an empire for the second time, we survived both, without being buried under the rubble, quite on the contrary. Freed from the Soviet occupiers, we were able to move independently and freely into the new 21st century. The new vacuum in the center of Europe, created by the demise of the Soviet Empire, was filled this time by the victorious power of the Cold War, the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, the collapse of the Soviet Empire put an end not only to the 20th century, but also to the age of empires. The 21st century is not a continuation of the 20s, but something entirely new. The western half of Europe, which hasn't had to bury its two empires, struggles to acknowledge that much. They represent continuity, the status quo, things that do not exist anymore. They act as if the end of the Cold War had only broken the Soviet Union and that both the United States of America and the territories it ruled could afford sitting on their hands. They refuse to acknowledge that the decisive factor in the demise of the bipolar world was the old new power whose existence they still try to deny, namely nationalism. The second half of the 20th century was still about empires. The 21st century is again about nations. In the 1990s, the nation-states of our region regained their independence and by doing so, crushed the Soviet Empire. Following in their footsteps, the Soviet republics also embarked on a path of independence, which sealed the fate of the Soviet Union. Nationalism has by now also eroded the hegemony of the United States of America, and the world moved from unipolar to multipolar. The realignment is fraught with trade wars and bloody conflicts because the United States of America, America's imperial elite, feels it now has the power to halt this process of world realignment. Its challengers, however, are convinced that their time has come. Nationalism is the driving force behind this world reshaping process. In this vein, President Trump, America's first movement, helped him to victory in 2016, just as the people of the UK left the European Union in the same year to take back control over their lives. Today, nationalism is the X factor all over the world. China, Russia, Ukraine, Africa, India, the whole of the Turkic and Muslim world are all working to assert their national sovereignty and promote their national interests. There is only one exception, and that's the European Union. And within it, the denationalized Germans. The European Union sees itself as an empire and tries to behave like one. The problem is that it lacks the means to have its imperial existence recognized. It has no common army, no common currency, no common finances, no common foreign policy. Most of its members still see themselves as nation states and do not want to be absorbed into such a pseudo-empire. Its imperial ambitions are mainly fueled by its own bureaucracy that has gone loose. And it's supported by the United States of America as a matter of convenience. By turning itself into an empire, the European Union's current leaders hope to infinitely delay the task of answering the question what the European Union's interests are and how they should assert them. Europe wants to become an empire after not having even been able to bridge the gap between West Europe and East Europe for the last 35 years. Europe's halves, after having been separated for decades by an Iron Curtain, are now further apart than they were when the Soviet Empire fell. The main reason is that while in our region Marxism was extinct by the 1970s, in the West, as the great Italian Catholic philosopher Augusto Del Noce pointed out shortly before his death in 1989, it triumphantly carried the day and took power into its hands. According to Del Noce, the core notions in Marxism were atheism and materialism, while its ideas on the economy, namely the abolition of private property, nationalization, and the practice of planned economy were secondary, in fact, irrelevant components of its ideology. The Marxist worldview was based on atheism, materialism, and a utopian belief in historical progress. These were coupled with relativism and nihilism. While the East communism became, while in the East communism had totally collapsed by 1989, in the West, by contrast, became an official worldview, a veritable substitute to religion. Western Marxists said goodbye without the slightest pain to a society of equals without exploitation, and began instead to believe in scientism and technologies. Accordingly, instead of pinning their hopes on a communist future to be won through revolution, they believe in scientific and technological progress. Marxism has swept Christian morality and values out of the Western world, but without replacing them with anything, with the resulting increase in people's feeling of insecurity and alienation, almost to the point of intolerability. No common faith, no common purpose, no common vision. This is what the triumph of Marxism has brought to the West. From 1945 to 1956, the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans was fought between godless Marxism and Christian civilization. The US represented the continuity of the old order, while the Soviets were representative of the new revolutionary one. By 1968, it was clear that Soviet-style communist regime had failed to deliver on the Marxist promise of a paradise on earth in terms of material goods. It had also become clear that the proletarians of the Western world wanted to consume more and became middle class. This is what prevented the student movement from selling their cause to the bulk of the population, and that's what also sealed the fate of the terrorist movements of the 1970s, which tried unsuccessfully to revolutionize France, West Germany, Italy, and the United States of America. Western Marxists began therefore to concentrate on achieving cultural hegemony, following Gramsci's teachings. They seized cultural bridgeheads and institutions, above all universities, schools, academic research centers, and the media. They gave up winning over the masses and only focused on the elites. Today, the cultural bridgeheads they have taken over, along with a series of tech companies and social media, have created and coalesced into a mindset industrial complex that pervades and dominates the world. 1968 proved to be a milestone, but the rebellious youth in the West wanted anything other than destruction. In Prague, because the revolution made clear that the communist regime could not be reformed. The Western revolutionaries have no ideas, only desires. They had nothing to say about politics. Their elites were quick to incorporate Marxism into their revolutionary tradition. In other terms, they re-Westernized Marxism. They brought it into line with French universalism and the liberty-centered American export of democracy. Once the Western masses were satisfied with the spectacular expansion of the wealth and consumption, and the oppressed of the Third World were liberated from colonial rule, new oppressed had to be found. The common trait of the oppressed is that they are victims and as such blameless, unlike the guilty members of mainstream society. From the 1970s onwards, the Western elites that had been by then imbued with Marxism were living in the fever of the sexual revolution, which pitted them even more against puritanical and asexual Eastern communism, which was culturally uninteresting and politically unsuccessful. It was then that young Westerners were introduced to nihilism, which sharply separated them from their father's generation that had rebuilt Europe from the rubbles of the war. The combination of the sexual revolution and drugs, LSD at that time, satisfied them for a while, and then most of them converted to neoliberalism and reconciled themselves with the economic and financial elite. The more Marxist vanguard merged with the neoliberal economic and political elite, the more interested they became in preserving and even reinforcing the status quo. The creation of an exploitation-free society was no longer part of their agenda. By expelling God from the core of its worldview, that is, abandoning sacrality and replacing it with utilitarianism, the Euro-Atlantic world removed the most important difference separating it from the communist Soviet system. From the 80s of the last century, it was no longer the godless against the godly, but two rival materialistic utilitarian systems, one more efficient than the other. The revolutionary communist branch of Marxism lost, the anti-revolutionary socialist wing won. The Marxist economic model was defeated, but the rest, anti-religion, secularism, scientism, technical and technological progressivism, with the expansion of sexuality into a central theme, got the upper hand. The separation of science from God became an accomplished fact, with the result of a perversive moral relativism. When in 1989, Western Marxism renounced communism and revolution, it turned its back on all that was grand and heroic. It was left with no other aim but the pursuit of profit, money, growth, and consumption. The current moment is the only thing that matters to them. It has nothing to say about the future. All this has resulted in the total alienation of Western men. Today's nihilistic elite promises to find solutions to all social problems through science. It intends to and is capable of transforming societies. That is what the export of democracy is still about. In quest for universal happiness. But if societies are so easy to transform, why stop there? The West today has become obsessed with perfectionism. It believes that through science and technology, it can transform societies and people, change their gender, their appearance at will. That's what genderism and LGBTQ+ is about. We, by contrast, believe that man's possibilities are limited and perfection is unattainable. Although progress in both technology and living condition is undeniable, neither man nor society can be simply reshaped. It is also an empirical fact that evil is present everywhere, in every age. Today, Marxists also expect science and technology to make evil impossible. In the hours of the demise of the Soviet Union, the neo-Marxist business-oriented West immediately imposed on us the kind of neoliberalism intertwined with savage capitalism that we hoped would help us catch up with them. We soon realized that this toxic mixture threatened to turn our region a hunting ground for profits and lobbies. We also realized that the European Union is seeking to erase the multi-ethnic and multicultural identity of our continent for the sake of economic interests and actors whom it is increasingly difficult to see as representative of the interest of the community of European citizens. That is why the eastern half of Europe sees the European Union more and more as a threat and not as an opportunity. It is important to be aware that what the West is now trying to promote is the same Marxist ideology that we learned to know the hard way in the second half of the 20th century, and that we already defeated once, 3 decades ago. We defeated it and survived. The shared experience of our region is that communists can be defeated, as is our ability to withstand the most intense pressures. We did not become Nazis. We did not allow ourselves to be Sovietized, no matter how much pressure was put on us. We have not allowed ourselves to be Americanized. We have always had the necessary resilience. That's what makes us confident. Western European elites, following the ever latest American academic fashions, is if on an acid trip are increasingly terrorizing their majority societies, taking their obedience for granted. They expect us to behave likewise. But over here, in the heartland of Europe, we have been through all the schools of totalitarian dictatorships. We immediately spot the totalitarian nature of the homogenizing will, and we are confronted with, for us, it lacks the kind of cement that should be made of mutual respect, recognition, of shared interest and goodwill. That's why we can't help saying to them, no. Thank you.